My name is Claudette. I am 58 years old, and I have spent 31 years building a life that I believed was also my daughter's foundation. I cooked the meals. I attended every school play, every graduation, every difficult evening when the world felt too heavy for one person to carry alone. I was the kind of mother who showed up without being asked. I want you to remember that when I tell you what happened at the will reading. My father-in-law, Harold, passed away in March after a long illness. He was a quiet, decent man who had built modest wealth through 40 years of careful living. The family gathered at the solicitor's office on a Tuesday afternoon. Myself, my husband Walter, his mother Dorothea, and our daughter Petra, who was 26 years old and had flown in from the city the evening before. Harold's will divided his estate between Walter and a charitable trust. There was one additional clause. A sum of money, not enormous but significant, had been set aside specifically for me in recognition, the solicitor read, of my years of dedicated care during Harold's final illness. Before the solicitor finished the sentence, Petra leaned forward. That should stay within the bloodline, she said clearly. It isn't right for it to go outside the family. The room went still. I looked at my daughter. She did not look back at me. I drove home alone that evening. Walter had stayed behind with Dorothea to speak with the solicitor, and Petra had gone to meet a friend for dinner, as if the afternoon had been entirely ordinary. I sat in my car outside our house for a long time before going in. I did not cry. I was too far past the initial shock for tears, and too far inside something colder and quieter. I kept replaying the moment. Petra's voice, steady and certain, leaning forward with that particular expression she had inherited from Dorothea. The one that looked like confidence but was something else underneath. Entitlement maybe. Or the specific carelessness of someone who has never had to consider what their words cost another person. I had sacrificed 3 years of my own health, sleep, and professional opportunities caring for Harold. I had driven him to appointments, managed his medications, sat with him through the nights when he was frightened and in pain. I had done it because I loved him and because it was right, not because I expected a reward. But to have my own daughter stand up in a room full of people and dismiss my worth as though I were a stranger reaching for something that didn't belong to me, that was a different kind of pain entirely. I did not confront her that night. I made a decision instead. Quiet one. I was not going to compete. I was going to be smarter than that. Dorothea came for Sunday lunch 4 days after the will reading. She had been coming for Sunday lunches for 23 years. She sat at my table, ate my food, and had spent the better part of 2 decades offering observations about my cooking, my housekeeping, my professional choices, and my general adequacy as a wife and mother. She delivered all of these observations with a smile, which made them very difficult to argue with directly. That Sunday she waited until Walter was in the garden before she said it. You know, Claudette, she said, setting down her fork. Harold always said you were the practical type. Not sentimental. I suppose that's why this whole business hasn't hit you the way it might hit someone else. I looked at her pleasantly. He also said, she continued with a small tilt of her head, that women who expect recognition for doing what family naturally does tend to be disappointed. It's just not how things work, is it? She picked up her fork again, satisfied. I said nothing. I reached for my water glass. But I had already taken out my phone under the table and opened the notes application. I typed the date and a single-line summary of what she had just said. I had begun to understand that Dorothea did not know she was building my case for me. Every word she said from this point forward was material. Walter raised the subject himself on Monday evening, which surprised me. I had expected him to stay silent the way he usually did when his mother and his wife occupied opposite sides of something. I think Petra was just trying to protect the family's interests, he said. We were washing dishes. He said it to the window rather than to me. She said it in front of a solicitor, I replied. In front of a room full of people. She called me outside the family, Walter. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't mean it like that. How did she mean it? He didn't answer. He dried a plate carefully and set it down. I watched him and understood something that I had perhaps always known but had chosen not to examine too closely. Walter was not a cruel man. He was a weak one. He defaulted to the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance in our family had always run directly through Dorothea. She had been directing traffic for 30 years, and he had been following the signals without questioning who set them. I dried my hands and walked to the sitting room. In my notebook, a plain blue one I had started keeping in the bedside drawer, I wrote the date, a summary of the conversation, and a note at the bottom. He is not the enemy, but he is not yet an ally either. I would need to change that. Her name was Aunt Rosalie. She was Harold's younger sister, 71 years old, sharp-minded, and the only member of the extended family who had never had any patience for Dorothea's particular brand of management. She called me 2 weeks after the will reading. She had heard what Petra said from a cousin who had been present. She did not waste time on pleasantries. That was a disgrace, she said. Harold would have been ashamed. I thanked her and let her talk. She had known the family for decades and had watched Dorothea operate across generations. What she told me over the next 40 minutes was more useful than anything I had gathered on my own. Dorothea had done this before. 20 years ago, she had maneuvered Harold's estate planning in a way that quietly cut out a cousin's wife following a family disagreement. She had done it through suggestion, through influence, through the careful cultivation of the right people's opinions over time. She never acted directly. She worked through others. Petra, I began to understand, was not the architect of what had happened at the will reading. She was the instrument. I asked Aunt Rosalie to keep our conversation private for now. She agreed without hesitation. Just be careful, she said before hanging up. Dorothea doesn't need proof of anything to start doing damage. She only needs a whisper. I wrote everything down. Petra stayed in town for 10 days after the will reading, and during that time she attended 2 family gatherings where the inheritance came up in conversation. I watched her carefully at both. At the first, a dinner at Dorothea's house, Petra mentioned the will casually and early, steering the conversation toward it with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the framing. She spoke about Harold's legacy, about the importance of keeping family wealth within the family, about the responsibility that came with inheritance. She used the word stewardship twice. It was Dorothea's word. I had heard it from Dorothea's mouth a dozen times over the years. At the second gathering, a lunch with Walter's cousins, Petra was slightly less careful. She laughed about the will in a way that had an edge to it. She made a joke I will not repeat here. One of the cousins, a woman named Harriet who had always been kind to me, went very quiet and changed the subject. I noted both occasions in my book. I noted Harriet's reaction particularly. I also noticed something else across those 10 days. Petra never once asked how I was feeling. Not once. Not even in passing. She moved through our house, ate at our table, used my laundry facilities, and spoke to me pleasantly about neutral topics. She had entirely compartmentalized what she had done. That told me everything I needed to know about the work ahead. Harold had given me something 3 years earlier, before the illness became serious. A small oil painting, nothing valuable in monetary terms, a coastal landscape by a minor local artist that he had bought decades ago because he simply liked it. He had given it to me one afternoon and said it was mine because I had told him once that it reminded me of a place I loved as a child. After the will reading, the painting disappeared from the hallway where I had hung it. I did not ask where it had gone. I checked the spare room where Petra had stayed and it was not there. I checked the storage room. On the 3rd day, I found it in a box in the garage, face down, wrapped loosely in old newspaper. I carried it back to the hallway and re-hung it without comment. The following morning it was gone again. I photographed the empty wall. I photographed the painting in the garage. I photographed both again the next day when the pattern repeated. I added the photographs to a folder on my phone, dated and organized. Then I moved the painting to my office, a room that Petra and Dorothea did not enter, and locked the door. No one mentioned it. No one asked. The silence confirmed that it had been deliberate. I wrote in my notebook that evening. Small things reveal the whole pattern. Pay attention to the small things. Dorothea began making calls. I found out through Harriet, who mentioned it carefully over coffee one afternoon, watching my face to see how I would receive the information. Dorothea had been speaking to several women in our social circle, the book group I had attended for 11 years, the committee I sat on for a local arts charity. And in these conversations she had been asking, with apparent concern, whether anyone had noticed that I seemed to be struggling since Harold's passing. Whether I had seemed unlike myself. Whether anyone thought I might need some support. She was building a narrative. Not a dramatic one. Quiet one. The kind that made people look at you with slightly tilted heads and careful voices. The kind that planted seeds of doubt about your judgment, your stability, your reliability, without ever saying anything that could be directly challenged. I thanked Harriet for telling me. I asked her to say nothing to Dorothea about our conversation. Then I contacted 3 women from the book group and 2 from the charity committee, and I invited them each individually to lunch over the following 2 weeks. At each lunch I was composed, engaged, and completely myself. I spoke about current projects, future plans, and the work I had been doing. I let them see me clearly, without drama or defensiveness. By the time Dorothea's whispers reached them, they had recent direct evidence that directly contradicted everything she was suggesting. She was planting seeds in soil I had already treated. Petra called on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the will reading. The call was short and ostensibly practical. She was asking about a family birthday gathering being planned for the following month. But near the end, just before she was about to say goodbye, she said something unexpected. "Mom, I hope you know I didn't mean to. I mean, at the solicitor's office it wasn't personal." I let the sentence sit for a moment. "What was it then?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral. It was just about the family situation. The way things work. "I understand," I said. "You're not upset." "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately," I said honestly. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. "Okay," she said. "Good. I'll see you at the gathering then." After I hung up, I sat with the call for a while. It was not an apology. It was far too carefully constructed to be an apology. But it was something, a crack or perhaps a test to see whether I was more wounded than I appeared. Petra had not made that call from generosity. She had made it because something in my silence over the past 6 weeks had made her uncertain. She had expected visible pain. She had expected to be managing me. She was not managing me. And that was beginning to unsettle her. The birthday gathering was for Walter's cousin Jeffrey, and it was held at a restaurant large enough to seat 22 family members across 3 long tables. I had prepared carefully. Not obviously. Not in any way that could be seen or named. I had simply spent the weeks beforehand quietly and consistently being present with the family members who mattered. Harriet. Jeffrey himself, who I had always liked. 2 of Walter's aunts who had been at the will reading and had looked uncomfortable during Petra's comment. I had called, visited, and been genuinely warm and engaged. Not performing warmth, but expressing the real warmth I felt for people who had not wronged me. By the time we arrived at the gathering, I had a quiet understanding with half the table that had nothing to do with the inheritance and everything to do with years of genuine relationship. Petra arrived confident and social, moving through the room with the particular brightness of someone who believes they are the most significant person present. At one point during the evening she made a comment, light, laughing, intended to be charming, about how she had learned from Harold to always protect what matters. Jeffrey looked at her for a moment, then looked at me. Then he made a quiet toast to Harold that referenced specifically and warmly the care Harold had received in his final years. The table raised their glasses. Petra raised hers too, smiling. But her eyes found mine briefly, and in them I saw the first real flicker of doubt. Walter started watching me in the evenings. Not with suspicion. With something more like bewilderment. He would come into the sitting room and find me reading or writing in my notebook, or on the phone with a friend, and he would stand in the doorway for a moment as if trying to understand the version of me he was seeing. One evening he sat down across from me and said, "You seem very settled." "I am settled," I said. "After everything." "Yes," I said. After everything. He was quiet for a while. Then, my mother thinks you're planning something. I looked up from my book. What do you think? He considered this seriously, which was more than he would have done 2 months earlier. I think you're the steadiest person in this family, he said finally, and I'm not sure I've told you that enough. It was not an apology for his silence at the will reading. It was not a full reckoning. But it was a man beginning to look honestly at something he had been avoiding, and that was worth acknowledging. You could start telling me now, I said. He nodded slowly. I closed my book and we sat together quietly for the rest of the evening. It was the first time in months that the room between us felt like something that could be repaired. I was in my car outside Dorothea's house. I had not gone inside. I had been returning a casserole dish I had borrowed and was about to ring the doorbell when I heard voices clearly through the open sitting room window. Dorothea was entertaining 2 women from her social circle, and she was in full performance. Walter has always needed guidance, she was saying. Left to his own devices, he would have let that woman dismantle everything Harold worked for. It was Petra who had the presence of mind to speak up. I raised her to understand that family means bloodline, means legacy. Claudette has never quite grasped that concept, I'm afraid. One of the women made an agreeable sound. She's pleasant enough, Dorothea continued, but she has always positioned herself rather cleverly, hasn't she? The devoted daughter-in-law. The devoted caregiver. Always making sure people noticed. Harold was fond of her, certainly. But fondness and entitlement are different things. I stood very still. Then I took out my phone and pressed record. I stood beside that window for 4 more minutes. I did not move. Barely breathed. When the conversation shifted, I walked quietly back to my car, drove home, and uploaded the recording to my cloud storage alongside everything else I had been collecting. Then I made a cup of tea and sat in my kitchen feeling something I had not felt in months. Ready. I spent November building. Not loudly. Not in any way that the family could see or interpret or interfere with. I worked in the mornings before Walter was fully awake, and in the evenings after the house was quiet. The first thing I built was financial independence. I had worked as a consultant for a public health organization for 12 years, and during the years of Harold's illness I had reduced my hours significantly. In November I contacted my former clients and colleagues and began quietly rebuilding those relationships. 2 contracts came in before the end of the month. A third was in discussion. The second thing I built was a record. Everything I had been collecting, the notebook entries, the photographs, the phone recording, the dated summaries of conversations, I organized into a clear, readable document. Not to use aggressively. To know it existed and was ready. The third thing I built was my position in the family's social world. Lunch by lunch, call by call, I became the person people came to with news, with questions, with a small daily fabric of family life. Not through effort or strategy alone, but because I was genuinely interested in people and had always been. And now I was simply no longer distracted by the work of managing pain. Aunt Rosalie called in mid-November to ask how things were progressing. Slowly, I told her. But in the right direction. Good, she said. The best things always move slowly. Aunt Rosalie told me the rest of the story in December, over 2 long phone calls. Dorothea had been working on Petra for years. Not obviously. Dorothea was never obvious. But she had spent Petra's teenage years quietly building a particular picture of the world in which family loyalty meant loyalty to bloodline above everything else, and in which my presence in the family was framed as a practical arrangement rather than a fundamental relationship. Petra had grown up hearing, in the softest possible language, that I was capable and reliable but fundamentally an outsider. That the love I gave was real but categorically different from the love between people who shared blood. Dorothea had never said anything directly cruel. She had simply laid a philosophical foundation, one careful conversation at a time, across 20 years. The will reading had not been Petra's idea. Dorothea had told her weeks beforehand that Harold's final wishes had been adjusted at the last moment, and that it would be Petra's responsibility as family to ensure things were handled correctly. Petra had walked into that solicitor's office believing she was fulfilling a duty. She had not been given the full truth. She had been given a role to play. This did not erase what Petra had done. She was 26 years old, not a child, and she had chosen not to look at her mother's face before speaking. But it changed the shape of what I was dealing with. Dorothea had not simply wounded me. She had spent 2 decades preparing the instrument. By January, I was busy in ways the family had not seen in years. The 2 consulting contracts had become 3. A small community health initiative I had helped develop several years ago contacted me about returning to lead an expanded program. Said yes. The work was meaningful and it gave me a schedule, a purpose, and an identity that existed entirely outside the walls of whatever Dorothea had been building in her sitting room. I began attending a monthly gathering of professional women, consultants, educators, healthcare workers, that a colleague had been inviting me to for years. I had always been too tired, too occupied with Harold's care to go. Now I went, and I found people who knew me only as Claudette, the professional, the woman with a career and a point of view, without any of the weight of the family history. Harriet mentioned, at a coffee we had in late January, that she had noticed the change. "You seem lighter," she said. "I am lighter," I told her. It was true. I had put down something I had been carrying for a long time without realizing how heavy it was. The constant effort of hoping that the family would see me clearly if I just waited long enough. I had stopped waiting. I had started building instead. Petra called twice in January. Both times I was warm, present, and entirely myself. I could hear the uncertainty in her voice growing. The misstep happened in February, at Jeffrey's wife's birthday dinner. Petra had been managing the family's perception of the inheritance situation with what I had come to recognize as Dorothea's training, keeping the narrative positive, returning always to the language of stewardship and family legacy, making sure her version of events was the one that circulated. But that evening, slightly relaxed by wine and comfortable in what she believed was sympathetic company, she said something she should not have said. She told a story about the will reading, framed as a funny anecdote, something about the look on the solicitor's face, and at the end of it she laughed and said, "Honestly, someone had to say it. You can't just let sentiment override sensible planning." The table was quiet for a moment. Jeffrey's wife, Miriam, who was 70 years old and had no patience for careful social performance, looked at Petra directly and said, "Your mother nursed my uncle for 3 years. I was there. I watched her do it. Sentiment had nothing to do with it." Table shifted. Petra recovered quickly, apologized smoothly, moved the conversation on. She was good at this. But the damage was done. Not publicly. Quietly. In the way that genuinely changes how people think about a person when they drive home from the dinner and the polished surface of the evening has worn away. I had said nothing. I had not needed to. Walter came to find me in my office on a Sunday morning in February, which he had never done before. The office was my space. He had always respected that without being asked. He sat in the chair across from my desk and looked at me for a moment before speaking. "My mother told me last week that you have been positioning yourself," he said. Her words. "I know," I said. "She thinks you're building something against the family." "I'm building something," I said. "It isn't against the family." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a while, which was when Walter was most honest. "I've been going back over the last few years," he said finally. "The things my mother has said. The things I've let go without questioning them. The way I behaved at the solicitor's office." He paused. "I didn't say anything that day. I should have." "Yes," I said simply. "I'm sorry, Claudette." I looked at my husband, this man I had built a life with, who was decent underneath his weakness, who had failed me in a specific and significant way, and was now sitting across from me acknowledging it with the particular difficulty of a person who finds honesty uncomfortable. "I know you are," I said. It was not the end of the conversation, but it was a beginning, a real one this time. In March, the community health program I was leading held a public launch event at a local civic center. It was well attended. Local officials, healthcare professionals, community members, and several journalists covering health initiatives in the region. I spoke for 12 minutes and answered questions for another 20. The feedback was immediate and warm. 2 photographs were taken that ended up in the regional newspaper the following week. One showed me at the podium. The other showed me in conversation with the local health commissioner, both of us clearly engaged and animated. Harriet sent me the newspaper cutting with a note that said simply, "There you are." I did not send the cutting to Dorothea or Petra. I did not need to. The newspaper was widely read. Jeffrey's wife Miriam called to congratulate me. Walter's aunt rang the following day. 3 members of the book group sent messages. By the time Dorothea saw the article, and I knew she would because she monitored everything, the conversation around it had already been established by people who were genuinely pleased for me. Dorothea said nothing to me about it directly, but Walter mentioned that she had seemed quieter than usual on the phone that week. I noted it without satisfaction. Not yet. There was still one more thing that needed to happen. Petra called in late March. This time the conversation did not stay on safe ground. She had heard about the newspaper article from at least 3 people before she called me, and whatever she had expected that to look like, whatever version of me she had been carrying, it did not match the person being discussed. "People keep talking about this project of yours," she said. There was something in her voice I had not heard before. Not quite resentment. More like disorientation. "It's going well," I said. "Miriam called me," she said. "About the dinner." I said nothing. She was quite pointed about it. Was that? Did you say something to her?" "I haven't said anything to anyone about the dinner," I said. Which was entirely true. Another pause. Longer. "Mum." Her voice had changed. Are you angry with me? I can't tell anymore. I don't know how to read you." "I'm not angry," I said. "I've been thinking very clearly." "About what?" "About what matters," I said. "About what I want the next part of my life to look like." She was quiet for a long time after that. "I think I need to come home," she said finally. "I think we need to talk properly." "Yes," I said. "I think we do." Dorothea made her biggest mistake at the Easter gathering. It was a large family occasion at Walter's cousin's house. 15 people, 3 generations, the kind of event that had always been Dorothea's preferred stage. She arrived composed and authoritative, took her customary position at the center of conversation, and held it for the first hour with her usual skill. Then someone, I believe it was Miriam's husband, a retired solicitor with no interest in social performance, asked me about the health program. I answered simply and honestly. The conversation expanded. Others joined. Questions were asked and I answered them. The room's attention moved naturally. Dorothea attempted to redirect twice. The second time she said something about the importance of family foundations in any professional success, which was her way of suggesting that my platform derived from Walter's family rather than my own work. Miriam's husband looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years in courtrooms and recognizes a misdirection. "I don't follow," he said pleasantly. "Could you explain what you mean?" Dorothea smiled and said it was just a general observation. "Claudette's work predates her marriage," he said, still pleasantly. "By some years, I believe." The conversation moved on. But 3 people who had been listening exchanged a specific look, the kind that happens when something that has been suspected for a long time is quietly confirmed. Dorothea had been seen. Not dramatically. Clearly. Petra came home in April. She arrived on a Friday evening with a quietness about her that I had not seen since she was a teenager navigating something she did not have words for. She helped me make dinner without being asked. She sat at the kitchen table while I cooked and talked about small things. Her work, her flat, a friend's wedding she was attending in the summer. After dinner, Walter excused himself early. I believed he had planned to. Petra and I sat at the cleared table with tea. I had not planned a speech. I had not prepared revelations or confrontations. I had something better, clarity. A clear understanding of what had happened, how it had happened, and what I needed her to understand. I told her what Aunt Rosalie had told me. About Dorothea's history of this kind of interference. About the framing she had built for Petra over years. About the role Petra had been cast in without being given the full picture. I did not show her the recording. I did not open the notebook. I did not need to. I simply spoke the truth plainly and let her sit with it. She did not interrupt. She held her mug in both hands and listened with an expression that moved slowly from defensiveness to confusion to something much more vulnerable. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. She told me it was what Harold wanted, Petra said. Her voice was small. I know, I said. That wasn't true. No. The full conversation happened at Aunt Rosalie's house at the end of April. Rosalie had suggested it, and I had agreed because her home was neutral ground and because she was, of all the people involved, the one with the longest and clearest view of what Dorothea had been doing across the years. Walter came. Petra came. Two of Walter's cousins who had been at the will reading came, at their own request, because they had been carrying their own discomfort with that day and wanted it addressed. Dorothea was not invited. I did not make a speech. I did not perform. I brought the document I had organized, the timeline, the dated entries, the summary of the recording, and I placed it on the table and let people read it. The room was quiet for a long time. Walter's cousin, the one who had gone still at the birthday dinner when Petra made her joke, looked up from the document and said, "She's been doing this for years, hasn't she?" It was not a question. Petra had not spoken since arriving. She sat very still reading. When she finished, she placed the document back on the table and looked at her hands. "I said something unforgivable," she said quietly. "In front of a solicitor. In front of the family. You said something that can be addressed," I said. "That is different." She looked at me. Her eyes were full. "I'm sorry, Mum." This time it was not carefully constructed. This time it was simply true. The consequences for Dorothea came not from me but from the family itself. Walter spoke to her privately in May. I do not know exactly what was said because I was not present and did not ask for a full account. What Walter told me afterward was that he had been direct, that it had been a difficult conversation, and that his mother had responded, initially, with her customary composure and her familiar reframings. But that for the first time in his life he had not accepted the reframings. He had named what she had done. He had named what it had cost. Dorothea did not apologize to me. I did not expect her to. But the Sunday lunches became less frequent. The calls to members of our social circle stopped. The careful, patient whisper campaign that had been running for years went quiet, not because Dorothea had changed, but because the audience for it had. At a family gathering in June, she arrived and found the room already arranged around a different center of gravity. Not against her. Simply no longer shaped by her. She sat and ate and made her observations, and people listened politely and moved on. Petra, sitting beside me, leaned over at one point and said quietly, "How long has it been like that?" The room listening and then just moving on. "Longer than I realized," I said. She nodded slowly. She was beginning to see what she had been standing inside without knowing it. By summer, something had settled in the family that I did not have a single word for. It was not victory. I had not been trying to win. It was not justice exactly, though things had moved into a truer alignment. It was more like the feeling of a room after a window has been opened. The same room, the same furniture, but the air entirely changed. Walter and I were rebuilding something. Slowly, with honesty, with the specific difficulty of two people who have to examine together the ways they failed each other. It was not comfortable work. But it was real work, and real work produces real results over time. Petra and I were rebuilding something too. She had begun the harder process of separating what she actually believed from what she had been taught to believe. And that kind of internal work takes longer than any external resolution. But she was doing it. I could see her doing it. I gave her time and I stayed present and I did not rush her toward a conclusion. My professional life had expanded beyond anything I had expected when I began rebuilding it in November. The health program was growing. A second initiative was in early planning. Colleagues who had known me for years told me I seemed more like myself than I had in a long time. They were right. I was more like myself. Because I had stopped waiting for other people to define me and had simply returned to being the person I had always been, the person who showed up, who did the work, who built things carefully and well. Dorothea had called me irrelevant. She had been wrong about the size of that word. I am writing this in the evening in my office, with the oil painting Harold gave me hanging on the wall where I can see it from my desk. The coastal scene. The light on the water. The place it reminds me of. A summer I spent as a child on the coast with my parents, before any of the weight of adult life had settled on me. Harold knew that. He listened when people told him things. It was one of the qualities I had loved most about him. I think about what I could have done differently. Whether I should have spoken at the will reading, challenged Petra in the room, confronted Dorothea earlier, demanded more from Walter sooner. Perhaps. But I do not spend long on these thoughts. The path I took was my own, and it brought me here, to this room, to this life that is genuinely mine in a way it had not fully been for years. Petra called this afternoon to tell me she had recommended me to a colleague looking for a consultant. She said it simply, without fanfare, as if it were a natural thing, which it was. Which it always should have been. Walter made dinner tonight without being asked. Small things. But small things are how the weight of years shifts. I did not compete. I want to be clear about what that means, because it is not the same as doing nothing. I worked. I documented. Built. I had honest conversations, and patient ones and difficult ones. I moved at my own pace toward my own restored life. I did not compete because I had never lost. Not truly. Dorothea had managed to make me feel lost, and Petra had been shaped into an instrument of that feeling. But the foundation they had tried to undermine was not made of inheritance or approval or family politics. It was made of who I am. And no lock can be changed on that.